Welcome to another book review. Today I will be reviewing Dostoevsky's Demons. So this book was first published in 1871. This translation is the 2008 edition, in which this one is in particular by Penguin Classics. This book is a lot of things. It's a philosophical, psychological, satirical, thriller comedy at times, and it is a long book as well. It's nearly 800 pages long. It did take me a while to read in comparison to some other books that I've read lately, but I can say that it was worth the read. So the premise of the book is pretty much that a group of young men band together to create a revolution in this time period of Russia, which is the 1800s, the late 1800s. And what this leads to, in a nutshell, is brutality and betrayal. To specify, this group is a group of 5. And as it turns out, all of this group of 5 individuals who are starting this revolution to start up chaos, to ensue their own political agenda, they all have as such demons inside of them, inside of their psyche. Hence the name of the book is Demons, or in other interpretations, the possessed, or devils. It's written insofar as it being almost like an observation being made on the characters. Interestingly, there's a kind of chronicler character that is portraying these characters and explaining their actions. And so it's set in third person, kind of looking over as these characters are doing what they're doing. What I found interesting towards the book, which I won't spoil anything in particular throughout this review, but what I found and what I most liked as well about how this book was written is that at the end you're kind of questioning if everything is true that the chronicler that this chronicler wrote. Everything that they wrote that is apparently true, it's kind of held up to question, and there's no evidence to suggest that it is untrue, but it's more so that this chronicler talks about himself as somebody who was around in some way, but it's never actually specified who this person actually is and what kind of agenda they have by writing these accounts of this group of 5. So the format alone of this book is interesting, just insofar as it's a different take on a third-person story. This is actually the third book that I've read by Dostoevsky so far. The first book I read by Dostoevsky was Crime and Punishment, which I thoroughly enjoyed, one of my favourite books. And then I read Notes from the Underground, which is probably another one of my favourite books. I was actually introduced to Dostoevsky by Jordan Peterson, because he'd constantly reference Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment when he'd try and suggest that an atheist isn't a true atheist because they subconsciously follow Judeo-Christian ethics and they follow some kind of ethos that is similar to what the Bible teaches. And I never really grasped the validity of what he's saying here, because Peterson would, as I said, he would reference this book, Crime and Punishment, with Raskolnikov, and he'd say if people were a true atheist, then they would act like Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, meaning that they'd essentially go and murder people. Maybe I should save this comment for when I actually review Crime and Punishment, which when I reread it, I probably will review it on this channel. But yeah, Peterson, he makes a fallacious claim, saying that you're only a true atheist if you go and murder people. Peterson makes such a fallacious claim, and it's very disappointing amongst all the other interesting things he has to say. He isn't wrong that we do follow a Judeo-Christian ethos. He's not wrong, but that isn't to say that you need to be straight up religious. And it also doesn't mean that you can't just you can't just point at an atheist and say, oh no, you're not an atheist because you follow some things in the Bible. It's like, well, no, because just because it's incidentally in the Bible doesn't mean you're acting out as if God exists in that aspect. Anyway, I'll move away from this because maybe I'll discuss it more in the actual Crime and Punishment book review. But I feel like it was worth explaining that claim that Peterson makes, which I found a bit, yeah, So moving on to the structure, there are 3 parts to this book, and this is where I'm going to start talking more about criticisms and things that were done well in the book. I certainly felt that the first part of the book was unnecessarily slow. It was good, it was entertaining, and I did skim through a decent amount of it because I felt not everything was really relevant. The revolution is even mentioned in the first part of the book, which is really amusing actually. But I do commend Dostoevsky for introducing his characters in the first part of the book. I guess that is what his intention was, to really build these characters before the actual premise of the book is introduced. So in that aspect, it does get better and better as it goes on. It definitely does. The third part is great. The overall length of the book definitely could have been shorter, most certainly. But at the same time, you have to kind of remember when this book was published, when it was written. And now a lot of what we do is instant gratification. And we don't necessarily spend as much time on things as we used to. Because now there are so many more options and so many short-term gratification things we can act out. Our fuse is quite shortened. And so its length can be justified. Because, yes, of course, people would work, but people had a lot more time and a lot more justification to read such a longer book. Because, quite frankly, they had no TV or they had no social media to flick through. So you have to take into account the time of which this was written to truly appreciate how long it is and why it's so long. Even if it is long, I will stay on the point of how, because the characters are very well developed, and as I say, there are maybe too many details, but I would say that the ends do justify the means, just because of how powerful the end of the book actually is. So there are actually about 20 characters to remember in this book. And as I said, there is a lot, it sometimes feels, of unnecessary dialogue or unnecessary story building, which doesn't really, in the grand scheme of things, have relevance to the overall story that's trying to be told. I have to be honest, by the end of the book, there were some major characters that I actually forgot who they were just because they were mentioned like 200 pages before and not even mentioned in the past few hours of me actually reading. So because of the Russian names, they are so long and alien to me, as I'm not from Russia, that it can be difficult to grasp every character in the book. Thankfully though, in my copy, in the Penguin Classics copy, they have, by the way, the Penguin Classics copy is amazing. There's so many good notes on all the French that can sometimes turn up and whatsoever. But there is a list of names that you can flick back to. So if you forget who someone is, you can look at them and then it tells you who they are without giving away spoilers. So there is a list of characters which is really helpful. But nevertheless, even by the end of the book, I was still questioning who some certain characters are, which is funny, but it's also kind of frustrating when you're trying to comprehend what's actually going on while you're reading. So in terms of characters, I'm not going to talk too much about the characters in depth, just because I don't want to spoil anything. But the group of 5, or any other characters like that, every character has a particular uniqueness about them. For example, one of the group of 5 is close to a psychopath. He's kind of the leader of the group, and there is a lot of character development on him. And then there's the beta male, in which he basically lives under the roof of this woman that has been keeping him in her house for about 20 years. And this character under the roof of her house is basically a failure in society. He's lost his money, and so he is like a beta male in terms of how we could try and define his social status. One of my favourite characters is definitely Kirylev, or again, I'm not going to try and pronounce all these Russian names because it would be pointless, because I will fail, as I just did. So Kirylev is a character hopefully I've got this right as well. But Kryleov is the character who is always like talking about God and how he says he doesn't believe in God, but then he says that he does. And something really prime about Dostoevsky's writing about religion and God is that he never seems to be sure of whether himself as a writer he believes in God or not. And it really shows in his characters, because Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, he talks about God quite a lot, and there's a lot of dialogue in this book as well centered around God. And the conclusion that Kryleov comes to is that whoever conquers pain and fear will himself become God. And there is another one as well. Man has done nothing but invent God in order to live without killing himself. And then there is this. If God exists, then all will is his, and I can't escape his will. If he, i.e. God, does not exist, then all will is mine, and I am obliged to proclaim self-will. So from these quotes, it is quite clear that this dialogue is very deep, and this is definitely why I found this particular section of dialogue, as it came and went throughout the book, I did find it the most interesting, because he's always in a battle between killing himself and not killing himself, because he knows if he does kill himself, then he himself proclaims his free will and is God. Whereas if he doesn't kill himself, then he, and this is according to the story as well, if he doesn't kill himself for the cause, for the revolution, he is a coward, essentially. And how all this pans out in the story is fascinating when you get to read it, if you choose to. I am really going to butcher this guy's name, but Stavrogin, he was my favourite character of the book. This is merely because not only did he have so much development as a main character, but he had a major chapter which was actually redacted out of the book at the time of it being published. And this is because there are some really questionable things that this character did, that Dostoevsky wrote, that even the publishers were like, no, we probably shouldn't have this in the book. We'll publish the book without it. I do see where they were coming from. At the time of it being published, it would probably create a lot of conflict. But I must say, and this chapter was actually taken out of the second part of the book, I believe, and it was replaced at the end, at the appendix, in this particular edition. And so it was the last thing that I read as the reader, because at this point the story all wrapped up. And what the appendix does really well, and it's not a large chapter, but it's of decent length, and it really fleshes out Stavrogin's character, and obviously it's quite an impactful meaning behind the story, because it really does hammer down the real complexity, the demons within this character, as well as the others, which were briefly mentioned at times. And so in this appendix, which I'm not spoiling, but the character goes to a church and he talks to a pastor of such, and he basically confesses a certain part of his life to this man. After this pastor reads this long account that Stavrogin has given him to read, they have a really deep discussion about the contents of what he wrote. Because as the reader, we read the letter or the writing as the pastor does. There is a really enticing reflection of the actions committed in this story that Stavrogin's let this pastor read. A lot of the time through the dialogue, it really does test the length of which people will go through just to preserve their honour or their cause, which is the revolution that this group of 5 are trying to uphold. So I would say the appendix is probably my favourite part of the entire book, because the impact it makes once you've read all of the story, it serves as a reflection, I guess, on Stavrogin in particular, but just on the entire philosophy and moral dilemma of what the book is putting across. What I find most admirable about Dostoevsky's Demons is that Dostoevsky predicted this revolution from actually happening. Because at the time of his writing this book, this was before the particular revolution at the time happened. And so this book actually predicted the future of Russia's political climate. And that in itself is awesome. Another point about Dostoevsky's writing is about how much attention to detail he actually puts into his books, and the mix between realism and fiction. Throughout this book, most of it is based on real life, on the current Russian politics at the time of Dostoevsky writing this. A lot of it is current in his era, but also a lot of it is predictions. And the funny thing is, at the end of reading this, at this day and age, you can look at this book as a history book. It really does come across as a history book, because a lot of what Dostoevsky wrote actually came true. And so whilst this book is extremely long, nearly 800 pages, it is worth the read if you are interested in politics, philosophy, psychology, criminology. I'd also say if you're interested in history, this is a great book to get some insight into the Russian climate of politics at the time. So in that sense, I would say it is a classic for a reason, for a very good reason. I have no idea how long Dostoevsky as a writer took to actually produce this book. I mean, the amount of ideas, the complex characters, the moral dilemmas, the politics, I cannot fathom how he conjured this book. It is that impressive as a piece of literature alone. It is fantastic. In terms of my enjoyment of the book overall, I did definitely enjoy the book. I found myself skimming through many pages, as I say, because sometimes it felt a bit slow, but I think, as I said earlier, the ends justifies the means. So thanks for the view. The links to my Goodreads account and my Instagram account are in the bio below. If you wish to discuss this book, please do so in the comments, and think about subscribing if you enjoyed this video. And I'll see you soon.